So far, there's a pretty important topic to sculpting in Blender that I have avoided, and that is the topic of lighting. Because Blender is a true 3D software with true 3D cameras and 3D lights, we obviously want to take advantage of that to enhance our sculpting experience. But it's a topic I have actually completely avoided so far because I just wasn't all that satisfied with Blender's lighting options when we are in sculpt mode. You may or may not know that in Blender, when you're in sculpt mode, and you're within this default viewport shading mode that is right here, that you can click on this little arrow that points down and you can go in there and you can either switch this matte cap over for something else, or you can switch over here to a studio lighting where you can actually rotate a few HDRs around, and you can even click on here and you can select a different lighting setup. When we're in studio mode here, you can see that we don't necessarily have any shadows that are casted within our viewport here, even if I rotated this around. So it's not that these options are necessarily bad, or the options that are already within Blender here in terms of lighting when we're in sculpt mode. It's not that they're necessarily bad, but I'm just not all that satisfied with them. This is actually very similar to what we could otherwise get within ZBrush. And I really feel as if Blender's power is really the fact that it is a true 3D software. So I actually want to be able to have some true 3D lights in here. And so far, that's just something I just wasn't able to really find a proper solution to. How to get actual proper great 3D shadows and a great lighting going on within the viewport when doing sculpting. Because of course, lighting is very important. Lighting is what we look at when we look at references. It is what we are trying to read and to help us simply judge whether we are doing a good job in sculpting volumes or not. Then the next thing I want to talk about is eyes, and setting up better eyes than what we currently have. And those things will help us judge, once again, whether we have our likeness down properly or not. In the future, I actually want to delve a lot deeper within painting over our head within Blender, because we will do a first pass on the albedo for this particular head within Blender. We won't necessarily use Blender to do the full facial texturing of this particular head, but I think it's actually very useful to at least do a very basic color pass over our head within Blender, just to once again help us judge whether we have done a proper sculpt or not. So we'll essentially block out or sketch out what will be the eventual color pass over this particular head, and we're going to do that within Blender, but I haven't yet decided so far what we will use to do the final color pass over this head. And that will probably be within Substance Painter. And all of these topics, we're going to talk about them before we start our third pass over this particular likeness sculpt, because those things will help us judge whether we have done a proper likeness sculpt or not. Now, there are also a bunch of matte caps here that you can actually switch around. But personally speaking, I just was never a fan of matte caps to begin with. And that's whether that's within Blender or within ZBrush. I just don't like matte caps because I just find that they're more distracting than anything else. Like, I can't really sculpt with this because there's just too much stuff that's kind of going on, and that just for me starts to become a little bit distracting. Like the volumes here that we can see within the shadow part here, I just find that they're just very, very hard to read. And I find that matte caps often add too much stuff here that just become very distracting. I like my materials to be extremely, extremely basic because I want to read the most basic light interaction possible over the surface that I am sculpting. And I find that matte caps, they just add stuff that I just find distracting. Now, some people may like those, and that's fine. I'm not passing judgment over anyone who likes to use matte caps, but personally speaking, they're just not something that I have seen the value in using. I really don't like matte caps either that add a little bit of cavity information. Now, I don't even know whether we have some of these within Blender, but we definitely have some of those within ZBrush. We have matte caps that just start to add a lot of cavity information. So the cavities of the model, the creases over the model, they start to get a different color or start to get a little bit of information that kind of gets built up in there. And once again, for me, it just throws me off. It actually doesn't allow me to properly read the creases that I have over the model and whether those creases are at the proper depth or if they're too deep, if they're not deep enough. It's distracting, and I just find that it becomes distracting and it actually throws me off instead of actually helping me read the surface better. So personally speaking, I love a very, very basic material so that there is nothing throwing off the interaction between the basic material and the lights. So these studio lighting, I'm not a big fan of. I think it's possible to get something that's pretty decent still if you customize your own studio lights. You can probably get something that's kind of decent in here. But once again, I just feel as if things simply could be better, really. Now, if you played around in Blender a little bit, you also know that you can switch over the viewport shading here to the rendered method. And that will use something like Eevee, or that will use something like cycles to render the viewport. And that's great. But the problem that Blender 3.2 has is that things get to slow down significantly even if you use Eevee in there, which should be the rendered mode or the rendering engine that is very, very fast and very snappy there. Just to give you a bit of a demonstration here, if we go in here and we switch our render properties here for the viewport here, and we switch over from cycles over to Eevee, and then if I go in here and I create a new light, so let's just go here to object mode, let's go to add, let's add a light within this particular scene. In this case here, let's just add a spotlight. And then I'm just going to take this here, I'm going to hold Control. I'm just going to click on the little yellow icon that is there, and I'm just going to click and drag that over the surface of our model. Let's go here within our little drop-down arrow that is right here. Let's say that we want to render this with the scene lights, right? So now you can see that we're actually getting some really good shadows going on in here because we are using Eevee. And so already the lighting here has been tremendously improved versus the studio lights setup that we had before. But the problem now is that if we switch back over to sculpt mode here, and I use my clay sharp brush here, you can see that now things slow down significantly, right? So it just becomes impossible to properly sculpt within Blender in Eevee, or rather in Blender 3.2. And so what I found out is that even though Blender 3.2 doesn't have that killer lighting setup that we would really want to have, especially if we are coming from ZBrush, Blender 3.3 has it. While I was doing research on the topic, I actually came across the fact that within Blender 3.3, which is actually coming later this particular year, if we read through the release notes of it, you can see here that under Sculpt, Paint, and Texture, that there is a drastic, in their words, performance improvement to the drawing performance when sculpting with Eevee that is enabled. So that actually addresses exactly the problem that we have been having when trying to sculpt within Blender with Eevee as the viewport rendering method. And the great thing is that you can actually grab Blender 3.3 right now, and I've actually done that. So we are actually going to switch over from Blender 3.2 to Blender 3.3 to continue this particular class. And unless you have stability concerns, which of course this is in the beta stage right now. So if you're in a situation where you simply cannot consider a beta release because of stability concerns, because you're working on a production, or there's something that's simply critical that you are working on and you simply cannot deal with any kind of instability there in any sort of way, then I highly recommend, if you are a sculptor within Blender, to switch over to Blender 3.3 as soon as possible. So if you want to download Blender 3.3, you just have to type it within Google. And then where it says Blender builds here, simply click on that and you will be taken to the future releases of Blender. And you can see that Blender 3.3 at the time of recording this particular class is at the beta stage. Of course, if you're listening to this class within the future, then Blender 3.3 will eventually get released and you can simply download the latest version of that. But at the time of recording this particular class, it is in beta. So you can come here and you can simply download it and you can install it and you can start to play and sculpt within Blender 3.3, just like you were sculpting within Blender 3.2. Now, I'm not actually sure if there's a proper way to install this, but you can definitely just extract the zip file somewhere, go within the folder, and then simply use Blender Launcher here to launch Blender 3.3. And let's just take a look at this, all right? Let's go here and open the same file that we had previously. Let's switch back over here to our Eevee rendering engine. Switch here to viewport rendering. Let's add a light in here. Same thing, let's hold Control, click on the little yellow dot to move it over our surface. And if we go back within sculpt mode in this particular case, and we use our clay sharp brush, or clay strips rather, look at how nice and fast this is. Isn't that wonderful? And look, we have this beautiful 3D shadow that is there. So that's amazing. This is definitely now one of the killer features that Blender has over ZBrush when it comes to sculpting. We can also, of course, click on the little arrow that points down here once again, once we are within Eevee for our viewport rendering. And we can increase the strength here of this default HDR that is right here, just to have a little bit of ambient light within the scene. When we select our light, we can actually tweak the settings to get even better shadows going on in here. With my spot that is selected here, let me go to the light settings that is right here. And then within shadows, let's go in here and let's turn on contact shadows. And you can see the difference that it makes. It actually makes our shadows much, much more precise. If you get distracted by the fact that when you do move the viewport around and when you are sculpting, that you can see that the shadows, they go from these nice soft shadows to these very harsh shadows. If you're actually distracted by that, what I would suggest is that you simply reduce the size of the light itself so that you have less of a drastic difference between the soft shadows and those harsh, more performant shadows that are showing up here. So all the while we have our spot selected here, let's simply bring down the radius here. If we bring this down to 0, you can see that now we will have those harsh shadows that will always be like that. And so when we do move the viewport around, you can see that there's no more of that distracting kind of change there from soft shadows to hard shadows. But I actually kind of like to have slightly soft shadows. I find that these extremely hard shadows, they're not necessarily bad if we are trying to mimic a sun, let's say, but I find that having just a little bit of softness to those shadows just make them come alive a lot more. So let's just increase the radius here of our light and maybe bring it around maybe between 5 to 10 centimeters or so. See, this really isn't too bad. We do have that softness, but it's a lot less distracting when we do move the viewport around, as you can see. Of course, we can increase the power here of our light if we want it to be stronger, if we want it to be not as strong. We can change the color if we want to have colored lights. We can play with these settings as much as we want, of course. But my goal really is to keep this somewhat basic. I want a proper lighting setup, and I want some proper shadows, but I don't necessarily want to start to add a bunch of colored lights everywhere, because once again, it's going to start to be distracting. As a final render, that's wonderful, but when we're just working, I really like to keep things somewhat basic. Now, perhaps things are a little bit too basic, though, when it comes to the material front. So looking at our head here, the way that the light reacts with the surface, although we do have those beautiful shadows, it still feels as if we're not reading the volumes that well. The lighting still seems to come across as somewhat flat. So what we can actually do is just to play with the material properties over the head, just to have a little bit of specularity in there. And that's just going to help to make those volumes pop a little bit more. So let's select our head here. This is our cube. Let's go to the material properties that is down here. And let's simply play around with these settings here. We're going to keep the base color the way that it is right now, but we are simply going to increase the specular value that is right here. It's not completely clear for me right now whether this is breaking PBR or not, or how much of this is a consideration within Blender, because I simply haven't played around with the materials and the rendering enough. But when it comes to simply sculpting, that's totally fine. We don't worry that much about PBR in this particular case. And then let's also play around with the roughness here, as you can see, just to get a little bit more of that specularity going on here, just to make it pop a little bit more. See, so that looks really, really good. We have some nice spec going on. If it's a little bit too strong for you, you can, of course, bring it down here a little bit. And we have those beautiful shadows also going on at the same time. Of course, sooner or later, one thing that will bother you, though, is the fact that this light is always static. Now, of course, we could go back here within object mode. We could select the light. We could switch over here to move mode here. And we could, of course, move the light around. Or one thing that I actually very much appreciate is what I have shown you before. When we do have a light selected, if we hold down Control and click on the little yellow dot that is here, we can actually move the light around, as you can see. And it's simply going to sample the normal that is under our cursor and make that the direction of the light. So that's really, really cool. And we can definitely move the light around simply by moving this around. And that's actually a pretty good way of doing it. But I actually, truth be told, really like to have a bit of a turntable going on. And I especially like to have multiple lights set up in different directions and to only have to play with one particular slider to rotate all of that lighting rig around a particular model. So we can't quite do that if we're just using this default little interactive mode here to place their lights around. There's really nothing wrong with this. I think this is a wonderful way to work. I think some people will simply prefer to move their lights around like that. And I think that that's wonderful. But as I said, I do personally like to have a bit of a turntable that is set up here. So by default, we don't have that, but we can definitely go ahead and build one for ourselves. So let's go back within object mode, let's add another light within here. Let's add a spotlight once again. And then let's hold down Control, click on this little yellow dot, and let's make this bit of a rim light. Anyone who knows me a little bit and has seen the kind of renders that I like to do know that I like to have those very black shadows once in a while. I'm a very big fan of the chiaroscuro style lighting. So by clicking on a little arrow that points down here, we can enable this little scene world checkbox that is right here. And that will allow us to go from this lighting where we have a little bit of ambient within the scene to a lighting where our shadows are inky black. And I personally also really, really like this kind of rendering style. And even so far, doesn't this feel wonderful? If I select my head back here and I go within sculpt mode and we use our clay strips brush in here, doesn't this look wonderful? When we're sculpting, we're getting these very, very nice, very strong shadows going on. It really helps us to judge volumes and to judge what we are doing. And it is simply impossible to do this within ZBrush. ZBrush cannot do this at all. But as I have said, the thing that I actually really want in this particular stage is to have a bit of a turntable that is set up. Because truth be told, when we are within this solid rendering mode that is right here, and we play with those studio lights here, one of the big things that is actually really cool about it is that we do have a little rotation slider here that we can actually play around here to just rotate the lights, right? So there's actually two ways that I think that we can mimic that within Blender. This is, once again, one of those things that I'm sure that some of you who have a bit more Blender experience will probably come up to me with what would perhaps be the proper solution to get this hooked up within the scene properly. But the solution I'm going to propose to you actually works pretty well. So if we don't have a better solution, this one works just as well and will allow you to get this going on very, very simply and will offer you a very nice way to control the lights. So this solution works if we don't have a better one. So how do we do that? Super simple. The first thing that we need is the center of our turntable, which will receive an animation that we will afterward scrub through using the timeline. So what I would propose to you is to simply add an empty within your scene, or anything else for that fact would probably do. But let's go here within our object mode here. Let's go to add, and let's simply add an empty within this scene. So let me go to add, let me go to volume and add an empty here. And there's also these other empties in here. And so feel free to use whatever you want, really. I don't think it makes much of a difference, but in my particular case, I suppose I'll just go with the volume here and add an empty volume within the scene. Make sure, of course, that this particular empty volume is at the center of the world. Of course, if your head is at the center of the world, if your head is a little bit offset, then you want to take that within consideration, but your head should probably be at the center of the world. So let's take our volume here. Let's go to item here, and let's simply make sure that the location here is set to 0. Then afterward, let's simply apply transforms on this to make sure to avoid any kind of problems within the future. Let's go to Object, let's go to Apply, and then let's simply apply all transforms to this. Now that our volume is where we want it to be the center of our turntable, we can now parent the lights to that volume. Now, there seem to be a few different ways to parent things together within Blender, but the one that I have found that seems to work pretty well is to select the parent first. So in this case here, we want the volume to be the parent of our spotlights here. So I'm going to select volume first, and then I'm going to hold down Shift, and I'm going to select all of the children of the parent. So spot 001 and then spot here. So holding down Shift and I'm clicking on those two. And then afterward, I'm going to press Control P on the keyboard. And within the menu, it's going to pop up here. I'm going to select Parent to Object. And as you can see, what that has done, that has parented the two spotlights so that the volume is essentially the parent of the two spotlights. That means, of course, that if I take the volume and I move it around, you can see that my lights have followed. The next thing that we're going to do is that we're going to create a very simple animation for this volume, and we're going to make it spin around itself. I'm going to move my cursor to the bottom left here of the interface until it changes to this little target icon that you can see. And once it is like that, I'm simply going to click and drag to pull up a new area. And then on the top left of that new area, I'm going to click on this little drop down that is right here. And we are simply going to switch over to the timeline, which will allow us to create the animation. So with my volume that is selected, I'm simply going to right click here under rotation within our transform menu that is right here. We're simply going to right click where it says rotation. And here I will insert a keyframe. Then let's turn on auto key, this little button that is right here within our timeline. Let's go over here to the end point of this particular timeline. And then where it says rotation Z here, still with our volume that is selected, let's click on this and simply enter the number 360. And if I scrub the timeline now, you can see that we have our turntable that is set up. Now, perhaps one more thing that we can do here, let's simply switch over here from our timeline editor here over to the graph editor. Then here, let me hold Control, and then with the middle mouse button, I'm going to press down on the middle mouse button as I'm holding down Control. And that will allow me to zoom, as you can see, on both axes. I'm just going to zoom down here until I can see the curve that we have created here. And let me do a box selection here, which will allow us to select all of the keyframes. Then afterward, let's right click. Let's go to interpolation mode here. And we simply are going to say that we want a linear interpolation. And that will simply make it so that the timeline here, you can see that we are going to go in between those two keyframes here in a linear fashion. Let's switch our editor once again back to the timeline. And I'm just going to pull this down here. So I'm going to pull the separation between our two areas down until all that I have left here is the timeline that is visible here, but I don't have the rest of the area that is displayed, which will allow me to easily select the timeline here and scrub through it to rotate our lights around. Of course, you can combine all of this together because we can now scrub through the timeline and rotate our turntable around. It doesn't mean that we cannot still move these spotlights around. I can still certainly do that. I can select a spotlight, hold on Control, click on the little yellow icon that is here, and I can still move a light around. We can still parent new lights to this particular volume. But this allows us to very, very easily look at how the volumes are changing as we rotate the lights around our model. If we're bothered by these little lines that are left over here from our turntable setup, we can go to our viewport overlays by clicking on this little arrow here that points down, and we can simply turn off where it says objects, extras, and relationship lines so that we aren't bothered by these things anymore. If you want to see your lights again, don't forget to go back within your overlays and turn extras back on to see where your lights actually are, if that is still important for you. So yeah, pretty cool, right? And as we have said, we're getting great sculpting performance in Blender 3.3, even when using Eevee and using these very, very nice light setups. And when we have these very, very beautiful shadows in here. So let's go back here to our sculpt mode here. You can see if I still use my clay strips here, we're still getting this incredibly fast, incredibly nice performance when it comes to sculpting. So that's absolutely wonderful. And it is impossible to get this within ZBrush. One more little thing, perhaps, is that sometimes you will see that even with those contact shadows that are turned on, you may still get shadows that aren't quite there. Because, of course, these shadows aren't ray traced right now. I don't know if this is something that they plan to add within the future, but our shadows are not actually ray traced right now. You can see if I rotate, let's say, my light here, just like so. I have a light that is coming here from the side, but it still seems to be lighting a little bit the inside here, the cavity of the eyes here, depending on how these are actually rotated around, as you can see here. So depending on the position of the lights, depending on the turntable, you may sometimes get the feeling that you have little bugs like these. Like this here shouldn't be lit right now because this should be occluded by the nose. So you can actually fix some of that sometimes by selecting your lights that you have within your scene, going to shadow here and simply playing around with the bias and taking the bias here and actually putting this value further down. Now that could perhaps introduce other bugs, but I have found that sometimes putting this bias, even just putting it down to 0 sometimes actually works pretty well. So don't be afraid to play with the bias here on your lights. But I do find that sometimes having this bias to be relatively low actually seems to give me shadows that just seems to be a little bit more precise. So don't be afraid to play around with that. So this will allow us to beautifully match the lighting that we have in some of our references when we are sculpting on a head. And it also allows us to really look at the way that the shadow is sculpting the shapes and to really help us judge whether our volumes are proper or not when it comes to sculpting. If we go back to our little drop-down menu that is right here on the top right, we can, of course, turn back off this little scene world checkbox if we want to also have within our scene just a little bit of that ambient light, which sometimes is actually quite nice to have. You don't necessarily always want to have that chiaroscuro lighting, although I do very much am a fan of it. And you can see here that the combination of those scene lights with a little bit of ambient light coming from that HDR there can actually do wonders as well. Of course, we can also switch this particular HDR over to another one, but I really don't want the HDR to be used beyond only being used for ambient light. So feel free to try something else, but for me, it's never something that I truly want to use to really light the model. It's always just to add a little bit of an ambient touch in there. So now that our lighting is properly set up and we have that turntable that is going on, now we can start to talk about how to get a better rendering for the eyes. And so that means how can we set up better eyes than what we currently have? Because the eyes that we have right now, they're just these very sketchy eyes that we have created very quickly. Just to have an idea of the size of the iris, of course, to have the impression there's a little bit of a specular highlight in there that has been kind of sculpted. But sooner or later, we actually need to have better eyes if we really truly want to be able to judge the minute details of the likeness in that zone between our sculpt and our references there. So let's import a texture in here that we will be able to use over these eyeballs, and which will simply give us better feeling for whether our eyes are how and where they need to be or not. Now, sooner or later on Outgang, we will probably talk about how to create an actual albedo for eyes from scratch. I suppose we will do that sooner or later. But the thing with eyes is that there's so many of them that are available. If you do a search online on any marketplace that you could actually think about, you will find albedos. You will find high quality eye textures, and not just had a bit of anxiety there. My phone actually woke up. I think my phone was thinking I was actually talking to it. I probably said marketplace and Google was like, hey, you want to buy something? So Any marketplace you could actually think about will probably already sell very high quality textures for eyes, not just albedos, but the whole texture set as well, normal maps, displacement maps. So in a way, there isn't that much value for us to spend some time right now to record a class on creating an actual albedo for an eye from scratch or other textures as well. But at some point, we will probably cover that as a separate class when we have a little bit of bandwidth to do that. But there's just better things to do right now. So what I have instead to propose to you is to simply either to acquire your own textures or to simply use the Algang eye albedo that I'm providing to you. As of right now, I'm only providing to you an albedo. But as I create this particular Emily Blunt portrait, I will eventually myself come on the topic of eye creation. And if I go ahead and create other textures for eyes, if I create normal map, if I create these things, I will add them as well to the handouts and I will give them to you as well. So for now, on the handouts page of algang.studio, I am making available for you an eye albedo that you can simply download and that you can use if you don't have access to other high quality eye textures elsewhere. But as I have said, I'm sure, and I haven't done a research myself recently, but I guarantee you that on any marketplace you could actually think about, whether it's a Blender marketplace, whether that's other marketplaces for textures or character data elsewhere, that you will, for very, very cheap, be able to put your hands on some very high quality eye textures. So go ahead and acquire those, unless you're going to do an ultra close-up shot of the eyes, and it is your goal to also communicate to people that you have created your own eye textures. There really isn't all that much value to spend the time that it will take you to create your own eyes. Just use anyone else's eye textures that have already been made, and people won't probably even ask you about that. Now, I'll be straight with you. I've created this a while ago. So once I get myself to the point where I will create the eyes for this particular fan art, I will see what we can do with that in the future. But for now, at least, if you're following along these particular classes, this particular eye albedo will do just fine. So go on the handouts page and get that eye albedo. So here's my eye base color texture. Now, for those of you who wonder how I have actually created this, this is actually a mix of a few different techniques, a few different textures that have been blended together. And a lot of this has actually been created within Substance Designer directly. So it's pretty high res. As you can see, this is a 2K by 2K texture. So this should fit for any need that you have. And as I clean up my own textures within the future, I will also either add the attached normal maps to this, or we'll see what we do once we get there. Of course, if you do decide to use this particular texture and you are using Photoshop, don't be afraid to set up a mask of some kind and play either with a hue saturation layer that is right here, switch the color of the iris over. As you can see, we could actually make a brown eye with this. We could actually bring the lightness down here, play with the saturation here, just to color the iris a little bit differently. And then afterward, using a mask here, I could actually just mask out here only the iris itself, and then perhaps invert the mask afterward to only color the iris differently. So that is definitely one of the ways that we could use this particular texture, even though it is a blue eye here, if we want to make different eye colors. Back in Blender then, what we're going to do is that we're actually going to duplicate these particular objects that we already have for the eyeballs, and one of them will become the sclera of the eyes, and the other one will become the cornea of the eyes. Perhaps it would make sense for me to start to name these properly, because we will start to add more things to this particular scene here. So sclera left, and then let's call this sclera right. Now, for those who don't know what a sclera is, the sclera is simply the combination of the white of the eye and the iris itself. And so we'll have that as a separate mesh, and then we will have the cornea afterward, also as a separate mesh. So we'll have two meshes for each eyeballs. Let me go ahead here and take our two sclera objects. Let me Control-C, Control-V here to duplicate them within our scene. And now this one here will become our cornea left. And this one here will become our cornea right. If you've followed so far the content and you've done exactly as I have done here, your corneas and your scleras, the way that you will have essentially created these eyes originally will be by using a multi-res modifier and simply by sculpting on there the shape of the iris there. So it just so happens that we still have that multi-res modifier that is applied on these objects. And so we want to keep it, of course, for the irises. In fact, we don't actually want to keep them because within Blender 3.3, we actually cannot have in sculpt mode a texture that is applied to an object that has a multi-res modifier. So actually we need to apply the multi-res modifier. We need to bake it on the mesh, whether that will be either for the sclera or for the cornea meshes. We can't have a multi-res modifier and have a texture that is also applied at the same time, unfortunately. So let's start with setting up the scleras, and then let's talk about the corneas afterward. So for the corneas here, let me just hide those two meshes. And let's take our sclera left, that is right here then, and then let's go down to our modifiers, and then let's simply apply the multi-res. Select our sclera right. Let's also do the same thing. I am in object mode, of course. You can't apply this if you are still within sculpt mode. So here, sclera right, click on this little arrow that points down. Let's click on apply. Let's select our sclera left afterward. Let's go to our material properties here. Let's simply create a new material. And then where it says base color that is right here, let's click on that little yellow dot that is right there. And let's switch this over to use an image texture right here. Let's click on open. Let's select our eye texture. And now our eye base color has been applied, but as you can see, of course, the mapping is actually wrong. So we need to remap this texture so that it is properly set up on our eye here. Therefore, let's go to UV editing. Let's zoom in on this here. Let's switch over here to use our material preview or to use Eevee, whichever one you want here, it doesn't really matter. So that we can see the texture in here, of course. Now, if you're coming from Maya, if you're coming from 3ds Max, every software really has its own approach to doing UVs, and this is no exception. Every time that I pick up a new 3D software, I have to learn how to do UVs again because they all deal with UVs in a very different way. And Blender is no exception, really. The tools are different, the workflow is different. So if you're coming from a different 3D software and you've never done UVs within Blender, that is, once again, something that you kind of have to learn again from scratch. But what I'm going to show you here is not in any way the end-all be-all of how to edit things UV-wise within Blender. But if this is your first foray within Blender, this should hopefully make a lot of sense and allow you to get the job done here. So what we're going to do in this particular case, okay, like first of all, we're going to hide the head so that we don't get to see it here. And what I'm essentially going to do here, I'm just going to do a series of box selection until I have the front of the eyeball that has been selected. Now, by default, as you can see, Blender does not select back faces or anything that is not facing towards the camera here by default. And so we'll just do a series of box selections while holding down Shift here until we have selected more or less all of the polygons. That is for the front hemisphere of the eye here. There is definitely a better way of doing this than what I'm doing right now, but as I have said, we'll get to this eventually. For now, I have not focused on learning how to do proper UVs within Blender, and we will eventually get to that. And now with this particular section that is made, let's position our camera here until we are looking straight ahead at the eyeball here. Let's go to UV, and then let's simply do a project from view. That will give us UVs that are projected from the camera. Next up, within our UV editor here, this is one of the weird things about Blender's UV editor by default is that you can't actually see the full set of UVs that is displayed on your object. If you're coming from anything else, Blender, Maya, this is actually very awkward, the fact that you cannot see the UVs of the whole object by default, but you can actually do that here if you switch over from this, where it says here at the top here, UV select mode here. If you instead select this little icon that is right here, it says UV sync selection. If you turn this on, this will actually allow you to see all of the UVs over the object, even without having to have a selection there. Now, and while our cursor is over the island that we have just unwrapped here, let's simply press L on our keyboard, and that will allow us to select that particular UV island. And then what we want to do is to simply move and scale this up until the iris is the same size as the one that we have sculpted. So we can actually see here where is our sculpted iris border that is right here. And so we want to scale this up and position these UVs until these are matching exactly. If you remember on the previous class, we were actually quite precise with the size of the iris. We really wanted it to be about 11 millimeters across. And so now that we are placing the texture, we also want to make sure that that is still at the proper size. We don't want to eyeball it. God, that's a bad joke, but it was just too fitting for me to skip it there. So we don't want to eyeball it, okay? We want to make sure that we are still creating an iris here that is at the proper size. So even though this feels like this could be a bit of a waste to do that, okay? It's actually very, very worth it at this particular stage to still use the measure tool here and just to, by holding down Control, make sure that we are creating an iris here. See, like you can see here that my actual iris here is actually a little bit smaller than it should be here. So I actually want it to be 11 millimeters across because that is what we were aiming for at the beginning there. So let's go ahead here and just scale and move this up again until we have that exact size for our iris that is right there. Of course, the border here, the border of the iris is a little bit blurry here, so it's not necessary to try to be overly precise, overly concerned with this, but as long as it seems to fit more or less here, that's kind of what we want. So that looks pretty good. I think it's centered. I think that's fine. We can do the other eye. You could obviously duplicate this over, but it doesn't take that much time to do the other one manually there. So let's do it separately as well. I'm going to take my sclera right, that is right here. We're going to go down to the material properties. And we're simply going to click on the little drop down that is right here to browse the materials that have been created. Let's select our material .001, which at this point we could probably rename to sclera. Let's go to our little drop down that is here and then select, I believe it is material here, not material 0.01, and that is the case here. So we could probably rename this to sclera. That would make a lot of sense. And then let's switch from object mode back to edit mode so that we can edit the UVs here. So let's essentially just do the same thing here. We just do a box selection here from the front. In fact, this would actually be a lot simpler. Probably should have done that from the beginning. Haha, there you go. Okay, so let's just do a selection here like that. Select the front of the eyeball here. Let's go back to UVs, project from view. Take that here, move it down, scale it up. And let's do the same thing once again. In fact, let me add that measure first. I think that was actually quite useful. So from here to there, let's see, let's hold Control down, of course, as we place that measure. So let's see here, how much is 1.1? It's about like that. That's not centered, but at least it tells me how big it needs to be. So that's what I'm looking for. And yeah, it feels about right. I think that's where we need to be. Let's switch back over to object mode. Let's go back to our sculpting tab. Let's unhide our head. Switch over to our rendered mode here. And there we go. We're starting to get some eyes going on in here. There you go. Of course, you can fine tune the placement of those irises as much as you want. Now, of course, you could wonder why is it that I have done these two eyes separately there. And truth be told, it's because, well, it really didn't take all that much time. You could obviously do it on one side, take the eyeball, duplicate it, copy it over. You could obviously do that there, but I really don't mind having two eyes that are slightly asymmetrical, just like I don't mind having a whole face that is slightly asymmetrical there. It's really not something that actually bothers me. In fact, I say that in 3D, we have a tendency to do things that are a little bit too symmetrical too much of the time because real life simply doesn't work like that. So yeah, it's not something that I actually mind if it really doesn't take a whole lot of time to do so. So let's continue to tweak these eyes, the eye material a little bit. We can actually get a little bit more out of it. So let's go back here with our sclera selected here. Let's go back down to our material properties. And the first thing that I really want to get rid of, okay, is the specularity over the eye, because you can see it's just adding a little bit of kind of gray white sort of everywhere, and really doesn't look all that great. So the first thing that I want to do is really just to kill the whole specule here. Let's just get rid of that entirely. And that already looks quite a lot better. Then let's add a little bit of subsurface in here to really make these pop here. So where it says subsurface here within our material properties, let's just add a little bit of that here. Just a very, very small amount. And you can see the difference that it actually makes. Perhaps I could actually add a little bit more than that. But as I rotate the camera around here, you can see the kind of effect that it actually gives us. It's really, really, really nice. Let me take a look here at our focal length. Let's go for a longer focal length, maybe somewhere around 70 or so. Yeah, that's a better perspective going on over the face there, as you can see. So that's starting to look pretty cool. This value may already be a little bit too high. In fact, let me just bring the subsurface radius down here. Let's just lower this here a little bit from its default value of 1, because it just feels like it's a little bit too much to me. So maybe around 0.5 like that. That looks pretty good. Maybe a little bit more, 0.6. Yeah, that looks pretty cool, right? So that's already starting to look really, really, really cool. And so there's two more things that we want to do. First is that we want to add now, we want to play around with the cornea to also get really nice reflections going on within these eyes. And the second thing is that I may also want to tweak a little bit the color value here for the skin that I have, because truth be told, I think the skin right now it seems to come across as being a little bit too bright. So let me just lower the value of that here down a little bit by selecting our cube here, material properties, base color. Let's just lower this here a little bit, just like that here. I think that looks quite a lot better. And so we want the eyes to be just slightly wider, but not by a lot. It really has to be very, very subtle. I think people have a tendency to add way too much contrast there between the color, between the white of the eye and the skin itself. And you could, once again, be tempted to add a little bit of subsurface to the skin. And, you know, for me, that's still like with the matte caps that we have talked about. You can do it, of course. And it will make your skin look a little bit more interesting, of course. But at the same time, for me, it becomes bothersome. It actually makes it so that I have a bit of a harder time to read the volumes, you know, because the light is getting diffused within the surface, of course. So the volumes pop a bit less. So although we can actually play around with this to make a final rendering of some kind and get something cool going on there, when it comes to sculpting itself, I actually don't really like to have a subsurface there. But hey, if you like it, if you think that it enhances your own sculpting experience, go for it. I think that's totally fine. But I personally like to keep it off. And now let's play around with the material on our corneas here. So let me turn those two objects back on. They have right now the exact same shape, size as the sclera, so we don't actually see them here. But what we're going to do is that we are simply going to get rid of the multi-res modifier, because if I actually turn the multi-res modifier off on these, or if we take here the viewport level here, put down to 0, you can see that because these have been sculpted using a multi-res, we actually are getting rid of the sculpted iris just by doing that, and we are now getting this nice convex shape that is going on simply by getting rid of the subdivision levels here within our multi-res here. So that's essentially what we're going to do. We're going to take the multi-res and we're just going to flush it, really. Now, if we take our eyes and we apply another multi-res or a subdivision here, whether we are in object mode or not. So if I take, let's say, the cornea here and I press Control-1 here to subdivide it here. So it's going to give us a subdivision modifier on top of our object. Because we haven't in any way increased the volume of this particular sphere, now you can see that our sphere for the corneas are now once again interpenetrating with the scleras that are underneath. So here's what we're going to do, okay? We're just going to add a very, very gentle push to the vertices of the cornea so that they're just a little bit offset from where the scleras are here. So with our two corneas that are selected, then let's switch over from object mode over to edit mode. Let's press A to simply select all of the polygons that we have. Where it says global here at the top for our pivot point, let's switch this over here to use the normals. And then where we have this little icon that is here, so transform pivot point here, let's switch over here from this median value over to individual origins. And now we can go to mesh here, go to transform, and we can use this shrink flatten tool that is there, or simply use the shortcut Alt S here. And what that will allow us to do, as you can see, is to simply very, very gently increase the size of these corneas, just like that. Let's get out of edit mode. Let's go back to object. And now we can apply a subdivision on top of this. And our eyeballs, our corneas are not going through the scleras. Let's select these two objects separately here. Let's select the right eye that is right here. It says level viewport. Let's just increase this here. Let's go up to, let's say, number 3 here until we essentially get rid completely of the polygons within the viewport here. Let's do the same thing for our left eye that is right there. All right, with that done, let's select the two of them. Let's go to our material properties. Let's click on new once again. And now, of course, what we want on these corneas is a material that has a very high specular value here. And let me select, actually, let me make sure that this material is applied on both eyes, as you can see. Unfortunately, it only applied it on one of the eyes. So let me select the other eye, select our new material we have created here so that it is applied in both instances. So what we want to do in this particular case, of course, is to increase the specular value until we have a very nice highlight. But at the same time, we also want, of course, the corneas to be transparent, right? So we, of course, have to play with the specular value that is right here. But let's actually fix the transparency first, because that is the more critical one that we want to get here. So, of course, what we want to do is to play around with this alpha value that is right here. Now, if I'm just playing around with it right now, you can see that there really isn't much that is happening. And the reason for that is because the blend mode is set to opaque here. So no matter what is the alpha value that we're going to put down here, unless its value is 0 here, we're simply not going to be able to see what is underneath this particular object here. So from blend mode opaque, let's switch this over here to alpha blend, which will allow us to have transparency. That is neither on or off, but somewhere in between, as you can see. Let's also turn off the shadow casting from these particular corneas because we definitely do not want to have that. So it says shadow mode here. Let's say that we simply turn this to none because we do not want these corneas to be casting any kind of shadows. And now this is the part where it gets kind of interesting. And earlier I was talking about PBR here and how we may or may not be breaking PBR right now by putting the spec over some of these surfaces to be very, very high. But the fact that we're just essentially just doing a nice viewport rendering in our case here doesn't really matter for now to really respect PBR. This is something that, you know, in the future will be good to worry about. It will definitely also make a great content for the website there. But for now, we just want to get something that looks good, right? And the problem that we have is that even if, let's say that I do increase here my specular to 1 here, okay? And we do play with the roughness here. So we do get those nice highlights that we're looking for. You can see that the moment that I reduce the alpha here, it's not only making the object transparent and allows us to see the rest of the eyeball underneath, but it is also making the specular also transparent at the same time. And that's a problem. We want to have very, very nice high contrast, very visible specular highlights, but we also want for that alpha value to be extremely low so that the cornea does not start to occlude whatever is behind it, right? Because that starts to look like cataracts or something right now, right? So the way to actually fix that, it's actually very, very simple, okay? Let's take our alpha value here. Let's put this down to 0.01, okay? So pretty much the kind of the lowest value you could have here for the alpha, which effectively makes these completely transparent there. And then what we want to do is to increase the specular value much higher than the value of 1. So that compensates for the fact that a lot of that specular is getting removed because of the alpha there. So let's take our specular highlight here and put it at over 100, just like that. And there you go. So one is balancing the other one. That's essentially the idea here. Then we can play around with the roughness, and also the size of these highlights that you will get is, of course, directly tied also to the size of the lights themselves. Also, perhaps we want to increase a few more subdivision over these eyeballs so that our highlights become nice and smooth. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's go back to our modifiers here. Let's put this higher here. So that's a little bit better. Unfortunately, we're still getting a few artifacts here because of the center. There's a pole at the center of these eyeballs that is kind of giving this to us right now. So one thing we could actually do is actually just rotate like this. Just rotate the eye around. It's going to have a bit of an arbitrary rotation value for now, but that's okay. And so as we said, these highlights right now, they're kind of big. I probably want to reduce them a little bit. I believe we're still using the default size for one of these lights, and we're still getting those flickering shadows here that is kind of bothersome as well. So let's see here within volume here, let's go and check our properties here for our spotlights. And let's go here, and this one here is set to 10 centimeters. You can see that this one here is actually still its default value of 25. So that's a very, very big light here. Let's bring this down here to, I don't know, maybe 8 centimeters or so. And there you go. Why don't you take a look at that? So that's starting to look pretty cool, right? You can see that as we rotate this light rig around, we have those highlights that just follow around really nicely. So that's really cool. As an added bonus, okay, like these specular, the speck of the eye, the speck on the cornea will also reflect the environment. So within our rendering properties here, if I actually turn off here where it says scene world, now we have control here over the strength, once again, of the HDR that is within the viewport. And you can see the kind of effect that it does, right? Like you can actually see the reflections coming from the environment over the cornea. So that's really cool. Let's go ahead here and let's just reduce this particular strength value though, because of course our HDR right now is way too strong. So just having a little bit of it within the scene, as you can see, it really adds a lot of life to these eyes there. And so it's actually pretty cool to switch over here to either click here on scene world to go within that sort of chiaroscuro kind of lighting here where our shadows are inky black. I really like that, but I also personally like to just turn it off, turn the scene world lighting here off and just use the default, or rather use the scene light values that we have control over now right here. I do like to use both depending on, I suppose, my mood when it comes to sculpting and how I feel about it. So they're both very interesting. We'll definitely try to switch back between those two rendering modes, perhaps, when we are working on our third pass over this particular head, because I think that they both allow us to nicely read what is going on over our face there. But I especially like how much more alive the eyes appear to be when we have just a little bit of that reflection going on within the scene, when we have a little bit of that ambient light contributed by the HDR there. Unfortunately, as you can see, as I rotate here the turntable, we're not actually at the same time rotating around this particular scene world that is here. But I think that's fine. I don't necessarily think that that's really a problem. Of course, we can obviously go back in here and just rotate this around if we want those highlights to be placed slightly differently. And someone who is very creative, of course, using Blender could also find a way to hook up this particular value. Unfortunately, I can't right-click on this and then add a keyframe to it. There's probably a way to do it somehow. There's definitely, if there's no way to just keyframe it directly, there's definitely a way to do it through code somehow to code it so that the rotation here follows the rotation that we have set for the volume through the turntable. There's definitely a way to hook all that up together, and we can make our life as complicated as we want there. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm very satisfied with this particular setup here. Even if we scrub the timeline here, that particular HDR doesn't actually rotate around. That's not necessarily a problem because they're still matching in the sense that the reflections still match what is happening with the HDR there. So as far as I'm concerned, they don't actually need to be rotating at the same time together there. And if you're concerned about sculpting performance, take a look at that. Let's switch back here with our head back to sculpt mode here. Let's use our sculpting brush. So let's go with the clay strips and take a look at how nice and quick this still is, right? This is really, really, really cool. Let's take our grab brush here. You can see that we can still grab and move things around. Very, very nice with a very, very good performance in here. So this is absolutely, absolutely wonderful. And there is simply no way to do this within ZBrush to have this good of a rendering when it comes to sculpting. And this is actually very important, okay? This is actually very important to be able to sculpt something properly, to be able to read the eyes, have some very high quality eyes. It does impact how well and how nicely we read our face when we are creating likenesses, especially. This definitely has a very, very, very important value as far as I'm concerned in my own eyes. The puns just keep on coming. This is an absolutely killer feature that Blender has, and that is enabled to us within Blender 3.3 that ZBrush simply cannot match. So I think there's some exciting things coming to Blender. I can't wait to see how the software grows with time. And I am here to definitely help it grow as well. So this is really, really cool. Now this class has actually gone on to be a little bit longer than I actually wanted it. But I do want to talk about how to add color very quickly to this head here. We will do an actual painting pass over this head sooner or later, perhaps even before we do the actual retopology. I'm very much waiting a very long time until we actually get to that particular topic there. But what I actually want to do is to just cover very quickly, though, just how to add a little bit of color to our head so that we can have a little bit of color information, especially going on for the eyebrows, because having eyebrows here that simply do not have any color contrast with skin can make it a little bit hard to read where they are and read their own relationship with everything else. And at the same time, I also want to add a little bit of color to the hairline so that we also know where the hairline is. And so I'm going to record this separately because this video is actually getting a bit longer than I actually wanted it to. This will be added to this same class, okay? So if you are watching this at some point within the future after this class has been recorded and posted, you will see on the website that there is at least 2 videos for this particular class. So one will be everything that we have talked about so far, and the other one will be for the painting there, just to cover a little bit very quickly what the painting is. And then eventually perhaps I'll combine these things together within the same video there. We'll see how it goes. Now, I did want to do a very quick painting pass over this head just to add a little bit of color to the eyebrows and to the hairline. But this class has actually been going on for a bit longer than I originally anticipated. So I will actually record that separately and I will add it to the video of this particular class in probably just a few days from now. So we will paint a little bit of color information for the eyebrows and we will just paint a little bit of color information for the hair so that we know where the hair is in relation to the rest of the head, and that will help us once again when we do our third pass over this particular head. So that's our class for today. Thanks for watching. The next class will be our third pass over this Emily Blunt portrait, and I can't wait to get it posted on the website. So keep an eye out on that, and there is a lot more Blender content coming to our gang in the future. Until next time, take care.